Hello, I'm Jamie Adams. I'm an assistant professor and movement disorder specialist at the University of Rochester. I am also the chair of the HSG Digital Measures Working Group with Lori Quinn, and I am going to be providing an update on what we have been working on. As a reminder, the objectives of this working group are to identify, develop, and evaluate digital tools to provide more frequent and objective measures of Huntington's disease in order to speed therapeutic development and enhance clinical care, and also to develop a protocol for a multi-center device study to identify a candidate set of digital biomarkers that can be used in future therapeutic studies in Huntington's disease. We formed this working group in 2019 and had our first meeting at the HSG annual meeting in November of 2019. At that meeting, we had a lively discussion about digital measures in Huntington's disease with participation from academia, industry, and foundations. Based on those discussions, we surveyed members of the working group to evaluate which digital tools were being used in HD and what digital outcome measures were thought to be most useful in Huntington's disease. We then developed a longitudinal digital assessment protocol and have spent this past year presenting this idea to potential stakeholders and partners. In fact, Lori or I may have met with some of you. I'll start with providing some background. With the emergence of genetic and disease modifying interventions, there is an urgent need for early and accurate assessment of Huntington's disease symptoms. We know that subtle changes in movement, cognition, and speech may occur early and often go undetected in our clinical scales. Digital tools can increase the precision of established measures, provide objective, continuous, real-world data, and help us evaluate new treatments objectively and efficiently. Including digital outcome measures in our HD clinical trials will enhance our understanding of the disease and likely allow us to detect disease earlier and track progression better than current standards. First, we need to systematically evaluate and determine the best digital biomarkers for various stages of HD, so these can be included in all of our clinical trials and ideally accepted by regulators as primary endpoints. To this end, Lori and I developed a protocol for a multi-center study to identify a candidate set of digital biomarkers that can be used in future therapeutic studies in HD. The aims of the study are to establish the validity and reliability of a battery of objective digital assessments using wearable sensors for in-clinic and at-home assessment, to establish the sensitivity to disease progression of objective digital assessments with aims to be used as potential clinical endpoints, to evaluate the relationship between objective sensor-based measures and subjective patient-reported outcome measures, and to evaluate group differences in sensor-based measures using machine learning approaches to explore new potential phenotypes. The planned study is a longitudinal 24-month study. We worked with a statistician and came up with a study population of 225 participants with 50 controls, 50 pre-manifest, 50 early stage, 50 mid-stage, and 25 juvenile onset HD. We plan to conduct the study at about 15 HSG sites. We are most interested in the digital outcome measures, and while we have tentatively selected a set of devices, technology is rapidly changing and we need to be flexible. I think this study could be done with a variety of devices, and in the end, I'm not sure it totally matters as long as we are clear on the methods of collection, the analysis, and the measure. For instance, the hope would be that we find a set of digital outcome measures that best detect and track disease, and therefore should be included in all HD disease modifying trials. And these specific measures may be able to be collected with a variety of tools, even commercially available devices in some cases. To make the study as robust as possible, we have included a set of research-grade sensors to be used during in-clinic visits, and then plan to use a wearable device to help collect remote measures of sleep, activity, gait, and perhaps even vital signs. We also want to include a smartphone application, which can measure motor symptoms, but has the added benefit of allowing us to collect data on cognition and speech, which have been found to have subtle changes early in HD. In terms of the schedule of activities, there will be a screening baseline visit followed by a visit 1 to 2 weeks later to evaluate the reliability and stability of the digital measures. We will then have in-clinic visits at months 6, 12, and 24. Each visit will include an instrumented motor exam using the wearable devices, a set of smartphone application tasks, and several patient-reported outcome measures. After each visit, participants will wear a remote monitoring device for at least 1 week and also complete smartphone application tasks monthly. We are still working on obtaining funding for this important study. We do have interested parties, yet as you can imagine, this large study is not inexpensive, and we are still looking for additional partners. I think the best way to do this study is through collaboration, where funding comes from a coalition of stakeholders, and we share data and move this forward to benefit everyone, especially our patients who are really in need of effective treatments. In discussions with Ed Wild and HSG leadership, we thought an HD digital biomarker summit might be a great way to get those interested in using digital measures in clinical trials together. So more to come on that. And finally, my work in Parkinson's disease has provided some insight on the importance of patient voice in this work. We really need to make sure that what we are measuring with these devices matters to patients. And we can do this by comparing our digital measures to patient-reported outcomes. But also, this study would be a great opportunity to simultaneously conduct surveys or do some form of qualitative work to inform us all. So that's all I have. Please don't hesitate to reach out to Lori or myself. We are really open, but remain very passionate about this project and know that this study is really important for Huntington's disease and for our patients. I want to thank the members of the working group and a few in particular who were instrumental in developing the protocol. We're going to plan another working group meeting, possibly coinciding with the Digital Marker Summit. So again, more to come on that. I also want to thank HSG leadership for their help in this effort. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you for joining us for an update on the Rehabilitation Working Group. My name is Nora Fritz, and I'm joined by Dr. Lori Quinn. Over the past 5 years, our group has been working to establish clinical recommendations to guide physical therapy practice in Huntington's disease. This effort has resulted in several published papers, including a systematic review in the Journal of Huntington's Disease and a clinical practice guideline in neurology. Next. Our latest work, which is currently under review, facilitates the implementation of these clinical guidelines into practice. Evidence has shown that it can take up to 17 years to translate published best practice evidence into regular and widespread clinical use. In this work, we recommend clinical assessments for physical therapists based on available literature, provide decision trees to aid in decision-making, and recommend strategies to overcome barriers and facilitate the implementation of these guidelines. Come check out our poster at the HSG poster session for full results and to chat with us. Next slide. In the past year, we have also recorded a series of videos discussing the role of physical therapy in caring for persons with Huntington's disease, including when to refer and best practice guidelines. This effort was sponsored and hosted by Teva. This series of PT videos complements a series of social work and psychiatry videos, and all of these videos are available at the Teva virtual medical booth at HSG. We hope you'll check them out. Our latest project is called Balance HD, the development and validation of a balance outcome measure for Huntington's disease. There are currently no validated disease-specific balance outcome measures for persons with Huntington's disease. We all know that balance is affected early in the disease course and progressively worsens over time, impacting the ability to move safely and contributing to increased fall risk. Improving balance and preventing injurious falls is of interest to healthcare providers for both rehabilitation and for clinical trials. Developing an HD-specific balance outcome measure is critical for capturing meaningful changes in motor function over time in persons with HD. In this recently funded trial from Teva, we will evaluate the reliability and minimal detectable change of currently available standardized balance outcomes in prodromal, early, and mid-stage HD, determine digital markers from wearable sensors that correlate with clinical balance performance and distinguish between stages, and develop and validate the most efficient composite outcome measure for balance in HD that is feasible to use both in the clinic setting and in clinical trials. This work will include 90 participants across the disease spectrum and across 3 different sites. We will incorporate a large battery of commonly used balance tests. Ultimately, this item analysis will be used to develop the most efficient composite balance outcome measure specific to HD, feasible for both the clinic and in clinical trials. And now I'll turn it over to Lori to talk about future direction.
There is substantial evidence for the role of rehabilitation in the management of Huntington's disease. However, there's a gap between published evidence and implementation in practice. We are proposing 3 sort of areas for implementation projects as the next steps. So the first is to provide a consistent framework for the role of rehabilitation in HTSA Center of Excellence and HD clinics. The second is to develop a standard assessment protocol. And the third is to develop patient and caregiver and therapist resources. With regards to providing a consistent framework for the role of rehabilitation, we can take our framework from some recent work that's been done in people with Parkinson's disease. And this is a project that was published by Miriam Rafferty, who is at the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. What Dr. Rafferty has proposed is that physical therapy for people with Parkinson's disease, and we can apply this to people with Huntington's disease, it should be at 3 different levels, having a consultative or proactive approach really early on in the disease, so people with prodromal or newly diagnosed diseases. At the second level, having restorative rehabilitation, and this is traditionally what we think about with regards to rehabilitation, seeing someone over some period of time, 8 to 10 weeks, for roughly 2 to 3 sessions to work on very specific skills and functional abilities. And then at the third level, skilled maintenance and rehabilitation, where people might need ongoing support. We really believe that physical therapy in combination with OT and speech therapy should be having this consistent framework throughout the course of the disease process, where people are referred back to rehabilitation professionals and they're seen also very early in the disease. The second component is developing a standard assessment protocol. Right now, unfortunately, we do not have standard procedures and accepted assessments that are consistent across HDSA centers or when therapists see someone who has Huntington's disease. We're proposing right now, based on the evidence that we have available, several measures which could be used in a standard assessment protocol. These are the 6-minute walk, the Berg balance scale, or the Tinetti mobility test. And then hopefully eventually those will be informed by our Balance HD project, which Nora just referred to, the timed up and go. Some measure of physical fitness, so typically considered a cardiopulmonary exercise test or potentially a modified version of that, and also use of wearable devices that might measure things like steps, a number of steps, sedentary time, or sleep. And these are all performance-based measures. We also think it's important to incorporate patient-reported outcome measures. There's a number of those that are consistently done as part of the Enroll battery or other standardized batteries, but we would also like to include a measure of physical activity, such as the International Physical Activity Questionnaire. Again, these being implemented relatively early on in the disease process so that we can get an understanding of both patient-reported measures, what their physical activity is, as well as what their functional performance is. And then the third area that we think it's important to think about for future directions is developing patient, caregiver, and therapist resources. Right now, we do have a number of resources that are available. We have a physiotherapy guidance document. We have the clinical guidelines that Nora referred to. We have an Engage HD physical activity workbook that we've been using in several of our studies at Cardiff University and at Teachers College. And we also have many clinical tips for patients with Huntington's disease. And a lot of that work was funded and supported by EHDN. While we do have these great resources, there are many more resources that are needed, and we also need some consistency with the use of these resources. So one of the things we think is important is having resources available for therapists so that they can have guidelines for implementing the outcome measures that we mentioned earlier. And another area is for patients to be able to give their therapists out in the community resources or information about how to best manage the disease. These are things that are being worked on both within our rehabilitation working group as well as our partnership with the European Huntington's Disease Network Physiotherapy Working Group. And we do hope to be able to provide standardized assessments, as well as having a website where all of this information can be gathered and have one resource available for patients, caregivers, and therapists. Thank you very much for your time.
Great.
Go ahead, Nora.
Welcome to the question and answer session. Jamie and Lori and I are happy to take any questions that you might have about ongoing projects in either of our working groups. If you want to just throw them into the Q&A section. I have one to start off about the digital working group, if you guys don't mind. This morning, Monica, Bussa, and Lori, you guys discussed your recent PACE HD project, which really was this novel intervention paradigm that could be amenable to remote delivery, potentially in the future. And I'm just curious, thinking about how the emergence of these digital markers might lend themselves to remote monitoring of symptoms and monitoring of change with intervention in a telehealth or a remote setting.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential there. We did use a wearable technology in the PACE HD study, and we used it in two ways. So we used Fitbits, which were part of the coaching program, and these did give feedback to the participants, and we used them as part of goal setting in terms of things like steps and looking at heart rate and monitoring activity levels. And I think there's been a lot of progress in commercially available wearables, which I think can really have an important focus for interventions. For measuring outcomes, I think this is something that's a really important reason why we want to do the study in the digital markers working group, is there just has not been good validation of these devices and the algorithms that go into things like detecting steps and understanding what the balance impairments are. So I think those can be really useful. One of the problems that we had in the PACE study was getting the wearable devices back. We did have some just sort of a low return rate with those. We also ran into some issues because some of the sites we were in the middle of the pandemic had already started. And so we had some issues with even just accessing some of the devices. So I think that really limited it. So I think when we do these kinds of studies and use digital devices, we have to make them as user-friendly as possible, make them very easy. And if they can be used in combination with a smartphone app, there's sort of this combination of passive and active monitoring. I think that's ideal. And these are things that are gait and balance, which is there's lots of different aspects, as Jamie talked about in the digital markers project that we're looking at. But gait and balance are two kind of motor functions and impairments that are really important to people with Huntington's disease, and they really impact their quality of life and their function. And so having quantitative measures of these that are reliable, I think, are really important.
That's great, thanks. I see a question that came into the chat. Jamie, do you want to address that by chance?
Sure. So the question is, are there any learnings from the Roche digital collection in their trial to inform design of this protocol? Yeah, I think absolutely. So we have spoken with people from Roche. We've also spoken, with Ed Wild, who's involved in some of their studies. And I think, we are going to try to collaborate and use some of the things they learned from their study in ours. Their platform is primarily a smartphone application and then a passive monitoring watch. And I think there is some opportunity to collaborate in sort of our app and things like that. And I think, we're hoping to get sort of all of these people together in a room to try to push this forward, using information that we've learned thus far in digital health studies. Lori, I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, yeah, I think that is really important to learn from that. And there's, I think also studies in other diseases, right? And what's been learned in Parkinson's disease, it's not exactly similar, but I think that's a really key part. And I think getting everybody in the same room and having a discussion about this is important. We did, prior to the results of the trial coming out, we did that with the working group a couple of years ago. And it was really useful to get people who've used these devices in the same room and talking about the pros and cons. And I think, again, just the user's experience is really important, and getting people to be able to use it and to do what we're asking them. I think it's just such an important component.
The other thing I was thinking about, thinking back to the first meeting of the digital working group in 2019, is that I thought it was really helpful to hear from the interdisciplinary group. So I think a lot about markers as they relate to gait and balance, because I'm a physical therapist, but hearing about how other people are using them to look at speech quality and to look at other motor functions was really, I thought, really insightful and really helpful when we were thinking about the design of the trial. And along that same line, I did want to mention that the rehabilitation working group is open to all rehabilitation professionals. So I realized that the information we shared today was really PT heavy, but we welcome feedback and members who are from other rehab professions. So OTs, speech therapists, etc. We'd love for you to be part of the group.
There's another question that came in. So can you address international collaboration in setting of implementation of EU general protection regulation? I'm not familiar with that. Jamie or Nora, are you?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I cannot address that. Sorry, Dr. Frank.
Yeah, I'm not sure. If you want to provide some additional details, maybe we can answer it.
I mean, I'm just sort of thinking that this might be that there's probably some guidelines around data protection and doing these internationally sharing data. I mean, I'll just, the experience from the PACE HD trial was challenging in that regard. And we did have to set up a lot of contracts and data sharing agreements, but it wasn't a major issue, but we did have to kind of jump through some hoops. So I think that's something we will need to pay attention to, I think, with the digital markers. Yeah.
Importantly, Lori, correct me if I'm wrong, but with the commercially available units like Fitbit, for example, it was all de-identified data, right? No patient names tied to any of that data. So that was one way to help ensure privacy.
Yes, that's right. And that Fitbit, we used a web-based server called Fitabase, which aggregated all of the data, and it's used quite a lot now in research. And that was really helpful because everything was de-identified, and we just were able to export the data really easily versus going into everybody's Fitbit account, which would just create so many issues.
Any other thoughts or questions?
Yeah, Nora, I was wondering if you maybe wanted to talk about any other projects that were the working group is working on. And I know you spent some time talking about the Balance HD project, and we've sort of been having a conversation about how there's a little bit of an overlap in the Balance HD and the digital. So maybe if you want to kind of talk about the direction of that and some other work that we're doing.
Sure. So, I think that we are interested not only in developing a Balance HD tool that was useful for clinicians in the clinic setting, but also one that could be used for telehealth. So maybe coming up with a battery of validated balance measures that we could use even just with a smartphone to assess balance in the home setting or in a remote setting. Now, that's at this point, we're still in the planning stages for that piece, but I definitely agree that that needs to be a conversation that we have with digital working group to make sure that we're all aligned around the same goals. Lori, was there another project you were thinking of?
No, I was just sort of thinking generally about the poster and kind of the work that we've been doing, sort of.
Oh, yes, of course.
Knowledge implementation. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. I thought you were talking specifically about the digital markers. Yes, we'd love for you to stop by our poster. So we've been really focused over the last year on this idea of implementation science or knowledge translation, which is really making these clinical practice guidelines that have been published with recommendations for exercise in persons with HD easily digestible for clinicians and easily implemented. So even for those clinicians who may not regularly see persons with HD, they can pick up this implementation document and have sort of a guide in hand about how to use best practice evidence in their rehabilitation plan of care. So we're really excited about this work. Ann Cluse, Deb Kegelmeyer, and Ash Rao have also been instrumental in the work. And it's, as I mentioned in the recording, it's currently under review. So we're hoping to hear back soon about that so that we can get it out to the clinic. And then the next step in this work is really to develop these tools, these implementation or knowledge translation tools that make it really easy for people to implement the recommended outcome measures in an HD center of excellence or even in an outpatient clinic, and to easily learn, exactly all the information they would need to treat a patient with HD. And then on the flip side, we're also interested in creating some information for persons and families with HD that they can use to advocate on their behalf for the best evidence in rehabilitation. So they can bring it to their neurologist or bring it to their therapist and say, look, I learned about these guidelines. This is what I want in my care. And so that's kind of the next step for us moving forward, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Nora. There's a couple of other questions coming in. So one is there an intersection point with the virtual UHDRS? So I think Sam's on typing in some questions, but yeah, I think so. I feel like maybe it's a little too late because it sounds like the project is already advanced far enough. But it would be great. I think there could potentially be an intersection. I know, especially with just the wearable devices, maybe not necessarily anything that's on an app, because I know that was really not sort of the point, but maybe being able to use some of these wearable devices that get sent out even to a subgroup of the population. That would be great to think about that. Jamie, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, or including some virtual UHDRS assessments in our study as an extension of what Sam is doing now. So,
there's another question too that came from Dr. Muratori about the consideration of environmental monitoring along with wearables that might be able to capture some movement inside the home without the person actually wearing a device. Has the working group given any consideration to that?
Yeah, so we didn't include a device like that in this preliminary protocol that we developed. There are, I know there's the Emerald device. It's sort of a radio wave sensor that gets installed into the home, and they are looking to use that, I think, in Huntington's disease. We've done some work with that device at University of Rochester. Seen some pretty good data, particularly in terms of walking, sleep, trips to the bathroom. You can even look at, like I said in the presentation. I mean, technology is just like incredible. It is rapidly changing. 5 years from now, what's what we're using now may not even be something we're using. So again, I think, if we can really focus on the outcome measure and like how, the algorithm and like what we're using, and then apply that to different devices, I think that would be really the ideal way to move this forward. But certainly something to consider, particularly in HD, having more, passive monitoring.
Great. Well, thank you everyone so much for attending this working group update and question and answer. If you have more questions later, please feel free to contact any of us. We're more than happy to chat with you. Stop by the posters and have a great day. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.